recording. All right then. Dodge-chan! What's up, people? It's undefeatable Twilight once again. So you may be wondering what I'm doing here, if you haven't already checked the title of this video. Yesterday, I went back and I listened to the first Twilight Storytime video I did, the very first episode, and I thought it was absolutely terrible. And I wanted to try do it again and maybe hopefully do it better this time. Like, seriously, my audio quality is abysmal. I can barely understand what I'm saying half the time. I am absolutely terrible at reading. Like, I just sound like I'm dead inside, like the way I read everything. And this is one of my favorite. This is probably my favorite book series in the whole wide world. This is not my copy, by the way. This is my friend's copy. I have lost my copy, sadly. I'm trying to find it, but I'm using this in the meantime. And I want to give it the respect it deserves, so I want to try this again. So this is Twilight Storytime Revisited, and we're going to go ahead. So this is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a trilogy in 4 parts, now 5, but it says 4 here, because this one doesn't include the 5th book, which I also have separately. So today we're going to read the foreword, as it were, written by Douglas Adams, because I think it's very entertainingly written. It's called A Guide to the Guide. So, here we go. A Guide to the Guide. Some unhelpful remarks from the author. The history of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is now so complicated that every time I tell it, I contradict myself, and whenever I do get it right, I'm misquoted. So the publication of this omnibus edition seemed like a good opportunity to set the record straight, or at least firmly crooked. Anything that is put down wrong here is, as far as I'm concerned, wrong for good. The idea for the title... Sorry, I'm being distracted by movement out the corner of my eye. What are you doing? Can... Sorry. Every time I try to do something like this. Okay. I'll hopefully... Sorry, now hopefully we can continue. Yeah, I just don't know why you wanted to shut the door or so. Yeah, whatever. Okay. The idea for the title first cropped up while I was lying drunk in a field in Innsbruck, Austria in 1971. Not particularly drunk, just the sort of drunk you get when you have a couple of stiff gossers after not having eaten for 2 days straight on account of being a penniless hitchhiker. We are talking of a mild inability to stand up. I was travelling with a copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe by Ken Walsh, a very battered copy that I had borrowed from someone. In fact, since this was 1971 and I still have the book, it must count as stolen by now. I don't have a copy of Europe on $5 a day as it was then, because I wasn't in that financial league. Night was beginning to fall on my field as it spun lazily underneath me. I was wondering where I could go that was cheaper than Innsbruck, revolved less, and didn't do the sort of things to me that Innsbruck had done to me that afternoon. What had happened was this. I had been walking through the town trying to find a particular address, and being thoroughly lost, I stopped to ask for directions from a man in the street. I knew this mightn't be easy because I don't speak German, but I was surprised to discover just how much difficulty I was having communicating with this particular man. Gradually, the truth dawned on me as we struggled in vain to understand each other, that of all the people in Innsbruck I could have stopped to ask, the one I had picked did not speak English, did not speak French, and was also deaf and dumb. With a series of sincerely apologetic hand movements, I disentangled myself, and a few minutes later, on another street, I stopped and asked another man who also turned out to be deaf and dumb, which was when I bought the beers. I ventured back onto the street. I tried again. When the third man I spoke to turned out to be deaf and dumb and also blind, I began to feel a terrible weight settling on my shoulders. Wherever I looked, the trees and buildings took on dark and menacing aspects. I pulled my coat tightly around me and hurried lurching down the street, whipped by a sudden gusting wind. I bumped into someone and stammered an apology, but he was deaf and dumb and unable to understand me. The sky lowered, the pavement seemed to tip and spin. If I hadn't happened then to duck down a side street and pass a hotel where a convention for the deaf and dumb was being held, there is every chance that my mind would have cracked completely, and I would have spent the rest of my life writing the sort of books which Kafka became famous for and dribbling. As it is, I went to lie in a field, along with my Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe, and when the stars came out, it occurred to me that if only someone would write a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as well, then I, for one, would be off like a shot. Having had this thought, I promptly fell asleep and forgot about it for 6 years. I went to Cambridge University. I took a number of baths, and also a degree in English. I worried a lot about girls and what had happened to my bike. Later, I became a writer and worked on a lot of things that were almost incredibly successful, but in fact just failed to see the light of day. Other writers will know what I mean. My pet project was to write something that would combine comedy and science fiction, and it was this obsession that drove me into deep debt and despair. No one was interested, except finally one man, a BBC radio producer named Simon Brett, who had the same idea, comedy and science fiction. Although Simon only produced the first episode before leaving the BBC to concentrate on his own writing, he is the author of the Charles Paris detective novels. I owe him an immense debt of gratitude for simply getting the thing to happen in the first place. He was succeeded by the legendary Geoffrey. In its original form, the show was going to be rather different. I was feeling a little disgruntled with the world at the time and had put together about 6 different plots, each of which ended with the destruction of the world in a different way and for a different reason. It was to be called The Ends of the Earth. While I was filling in the details of the first plot, in which the Earth was demolished to make way for a new hyperspace express route, I realised that I needed to have someone from a different planet around to tell the reader what was going on, to give the story the context it needed, so I had to work out who he was and what he was doing on the Earth. I decided to call him Ford Prefect. This was a joke that missed American audiences entirely, of course, since they had never heard of the rather oddly named car, and many thought it was a typing error for perfect. I explained in the text that the minimal research my alien character had done before arriving on this planet had led him to think that this name would be nicely inconspicuous. He had simply mistaken the dominant life form. So how would such a mistake arise? I remembered when I used to hitchhike through Europe and would often find the information or advice that came my way was out of date or misleading in some way. Most of it, of course, just came from stories of other people's travel experiences. At that point, the title Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy suddenly popped back into my mind from wherever it had been hiding all this time. Ford, I decided, would be a researcher who collected data for the guide. As soon as I started to develop this particular notion, it moved inexorably to the centre of the story, and the rest, as the creator of the original Ford Prefect would say, is bunk. The story grew in the most convoluted way, as many people will be surprised to learn. Writing episodically meant that when I finished one episode, I had no idea about what the next one would contain. When, in the twists and turns of the plot, some event suddenly seemed to illuminate things that had gone before, I was as surprised as anyone else. I think that the BBC's attitude towards the show while it was in production was very similar to that which Macbeth had towards murdering people: initial doubts, followed by cautious enthusiasm, and then greater and greater alarm at the sheer scale of the undertaking and still no end in sight. Reports that Geoffrey and I and the sound engineers were buried in a subterranean studio for weeks on end, taking as long to produce a single sound effect as other people took to produce an entire series, and stealing everybody else's studio time in which to do so, were all vigorously denied and absolutely true. The budget of the series escalated to the point that it could have practically paid for a few seconds of Dallas, if the show hadn't worked. The first episode went out on BBC Radio 4 at 10:30 p.m. on Wednesday 8th of March 1978, in a huge blaze of no publicity at all. Bats heard it. The odd dog barked. After a couple of weeks, a letter or two trickled in, so someone out there had listened. People I talked to seemed to like Marvin the paranoid android, whom I had written in as a one-scene joke and had only developed further at Geoffrey's insistence. Then some publishers became interested, and I was commissioned by Pan Books to write up the series in book form. After a lot of procrastination and hiding and inventing excuses and having baths, I managed to get about 2/3 of it done. At this point, they said, very pleasantly and politely, that I had already passed 10 deadlines, so would I please just finish the page I was on and let them have the damn thing. Meanwhile, I was busy trying to write another series and was also writing and script editing Doctor Who, because while it was all very pleasant to have your own radio series, especially one that somebody had written in to say they had heard, it didn't exactly buy you lunch. So that was more or less the situation when the book The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was published in September 1979 and appeared on the Sunday Times bestseller list at #1 and just stayed there. Clearly somebody had been listening. This is where things start getting complicated, and this is what I was asked in writing this introduction to explain. The guide has appeared in so many forms: books, radio, a television series, records, and soon to be a major motion picture, each time with a different storyline that even its most acute followers have become baffled at times. Here then is a breakdown of the different versions, not including the various stage versions, which only complicate the matter further. The radio series began in March 1978. The first series consisted of 6 programs, or FITs as they were called. FITs 1 to 6. Easy. Later that year, one more episode was recorded and broadcast, commonly known as the Christmas episode. It contained no reference of any kind to Christmas. It was called the Christmas episode because it was first broadcast on 24th of December, which is not Christmas Day. After this, things began to get increasingly complicated. In the autumn of 1979, the first Hitchhiker book was published, called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was a substantially expanded version of the first 4 episodes of the radio series, in which some of the characters behaved in entirely different ways, and others behaved in exactly the same ways, but for entirely different reasons, which amounts to the same thing, but saves rewriting the dialogue. At roughly the same time, a double record album was released, which was, by contrast, a slightly contracted version of the first 4 episodes of the radio series. These were not the recordings that were originally broadcast, but wholly new recordings of substantially the same scripts. This was done because we had used music off gramophone records as incidental music for the series, which is fine on radio but makes commercial release impossible. In January 1980, 5 new episodes of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy were broadcast all in 1 week, bringing the total number to 12 episodes. In the autumn of 1980, the second Hitchhiker book was published in Britain, around the same time that Harmony Books published the first book in the United States. It was a very substantially reworked, re-edited, and contracted version of episodes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 5, and 6, in that order, of the radio series The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. In case that seemed too straightforward, the book was called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, because it included the material from radio episode 5 of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was set in a restaurant called Milliways, otherwise known as the Restaurant at the End of the Universe. At roughly the same time, a second record album was made featuring a heavily rewritten and expanded version of episodes 5 and 6 of the radio series. This record album was also called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Meanwhile, a series of 6 television episodes of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was made by the BBC and broadcast in January 1981. This was based, more or less, on the first 6 episodes of the radio series. In other words, it incorporated most of the book The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the second half of the book The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Therefore, though it followed the basic structure of the radio series, it incorporated revisions from the books, which didn't. In January 1982, Harmony Books published The Restaurant at the End of the Universe in the United States. In the summer of 1982, a third Hitchhiker book was published simultaneously in Britain and the United States, called Life, the Universe, and Everything. This was not based on anything that has already been heard or seen on radio or television. In fact, it flatly contradicted episodes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 of the radio series. These episodes of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you will remember, had already been incorporated in revised form in the book called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. At this point, I went to America to write a film screenplay which was completely inconsistent with most of what had gone on so far, and since that film was then delayed in the making, a rumour currently has it that filming will start shortly before The Last Trump, I wrote one fourth and last book in the trilogy, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. This was published in Britain and in the USA in the autumn of 1984, and it effectively contradicted everything to date, up to and including itself. People often ask me how, under these circumstances, they can best leave the planet, so I have prepared some brief notes. How to leave the planet. 1. Phone NASA. Their phone number is 731-483-3111. Explain that it's very important that you get away as soon as possible. 2. If they do not cooperate, phone any friend you may have in the White House, 202-456-1414, to have a word on your behalf with the guys at NASA. 3. If you don't have any friends at the White House, phone the Kremlin. Ask the overseas operator for 0107-095-295-9051. They don't have any friends there either, at least none to speak of, but they do seem to have a little influence, so you may as well try. 4. If that also fails, phone the Pope for guidance. His telephone number is 011-396-6982, and I gather his switchboard is infallible. 5. If all these attempts fail, flag down a passing flying saucer and explain that it's vitally important you get away before your phone bill arrives. Douglas Adams, Los Angeles, 1983, and London, 1985. So here in my original video is where I stopped, because I was, as I said, exhausted, and yeah, I can kind of tell from listening to me, but nope. This time, we're going all the way, baby. We're going to go for the prologue and chapter 1 of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So, far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet, whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. I think they're missing a word there. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place, and some said that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should ever have left the oceans. And then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realised what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story, but it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Ulon Kalufid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway? In many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopaedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom, for though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and secondly, it has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed in large friendly letters on its cover. I was checking to see if it had that on the cover of this book, but it doesn't, so whatever. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book, begins very simply. It begins with a house. Chapter 1. The house stood on a slight rise just on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of West Country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front, of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London, because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. I understand that feeling. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was, too. Most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night it had rained very heavily, the lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear, as it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily round his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so, scrub. Shaving mirror, pointing at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped on to the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it at great length, he rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he'd decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Prosser was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat and shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though he didn't know it, he was also a direct male-line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry were a pronounced stoutness about the tum and a predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was a nervous, worried man. Today he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. What is that? Oh, it's this, okay. I was like, what is that black thing in the background? Come off it, Mr. Dent, he said. You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely. He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. I'm game, he said. We'll see who rusts first. I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it, said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it round the top of his head. This bypass has got to be built, and it's going to be built. First I've heard of it, said Arthur. Why has it got to be built? Sorry. Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him for a bit, then stopped and put it away again. What do you mean, why's it got to be built? He said. It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses. Bypasses are devices which allow some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, whilst other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly in between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there, and what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wish that people would just once and for all work out where the hell they want it to be. Well, sorry, I was leaning on the mouse. There we go. Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular, it was just any convenient point a very long way from points A, B and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D with axes over the door and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why, he just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said, You were quite entitled to make any suggestions or protests at the appropriate time, you know. Appropriate time? Hooted Arthur. Appropriate time? The first I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my home yesterday. I asked him if he'd come to clean the windows, and he said no, he'd come to demolish the house. Oh, he didn't tell me straight away, of course, oh no. First he wiped a couple of windows and charged me $5, then he told me. But Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh yes, well as soon as I heard I went straight round to see them, yesterday afternoon. You hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anybody or anything. But the plans were on display. On display? I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the display department. With a torch. Ah, well, the lights have probably gone. So are the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you? Yes, said Arthur, yes I did. It was on display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet, stuck in a disused lavatory with a sign on the door saying, Beware of the leopard. A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay propped up on his elbow in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at it. It's not as if it's a particularly nice house, he said. I'm sorry, but I happen to like it. You'll like the bypass. Oh, shut up, said Arthur Dent. Shut up and go away, and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on, and you know it. Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times, whilst his mind was for a moment filled with inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruin, with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Prosser was often bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment and then pulled himself together. Mr. Dent, he said. Hello. Yes, said Arthur. Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage that bulldozer would suffer if I just let it roll straight over you? How much? Said Arthur. None at all, said Mr. Prosser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen all shouting at him. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and not from Guildford as he usually claimed. Arthur Dent had never ever suspected this. This friend of his had first arrived on the planet Earth some 15 Earth years previously, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth's society, with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder, though, because he had skimped a bit on his preparatory research. The information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Prefect as being nicely inconspicuous. He was not conspicuously tall, his features were striking but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was wiry and gingerish and brushed backwards from the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled backwards from the nose. There was something very slightly odd about him, but it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and when you talked to him for any length of time, your eyes began involuntarily to water on his behalf. Perhaps it was that he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he had made on Earth as an eccentric, but a harmless one, an unruly boozer with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gatecrash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making fun of any astrophysicists he could find till he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily for a moment, relax and grin. "Oh, just looking for flying saucers," he would joke, and everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucers he was looking for. "Green ones," he would reply with a wicked grin, laugh wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge for the nearest bar and buy an enormous round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull and whiskey, huddle into a corner with some girl, and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the colour of the flying saucers didn't matter that much, really. Thereafter, staggering semi-paralytic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew the way to Beetlejuice. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's about time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, I'm trying to," is what Ford invariably replied on these occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was that green was the traditional space livery of the Beetlejuice trading scouts. Ford Prefect was desperate that any flying saucer at all would arrive soon, because 15 years was a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-bogglingly dull as the Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon, because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get lifts from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with the occasional new ploy, such as the "for the public good" talk, or the March of Progress talk, the "they knocked my house down once, never looked back" talk, and various other cajoleries and threats. And it was the bulldozer driver's accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. A shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up and, squinting into the sun, was startled to see Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford! Hello, how are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've just got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of because they'll knock my house down if I don't, but other than that, well, no, not especially. Why?" They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford Prefect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there any way we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds Ford seemed to ignore him and stared fixedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then suddenly he squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now. We'll go to the pub in the village." He looked into the sky again, nervous, expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock my house down." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do it while you're away, can't he?" he asked. "But I don't want him to." "Ah." "Look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to tell you in the saloon bar of the Horse and Groom." "But why?" "Because you're going to need a very stiff drink." Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that this was because of an old drinking game that Ford learned to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Madronite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestling, and was played like this. Two contestants would sit either side of a table with a glass in front of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of Jank spirit, as immortalized in that ancient Orion mining song. Oh, don't give me none more of that old Jank spirit. No, don't you give me none more of that old Jank spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old Jank spirit? Each of the two contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour spirit into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again. Once you started to lose, you would probably keep losing, because one of the effects of Jank spirit is to depress telepsychic power. As soon as a predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who perhaps began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the horse and groom after all. But what about my house? He asked plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. He wants to knock your house down? Yes, he wants to build, and he can't because you're lying in front of his bulldozer. Yes, and I'm sure we can come to some arrangement, said Ford. Excuse me, he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with the spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had company. Yes, hello, he called. Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet? Can we, for the moment, called Ford, assume that he hasn't? Well, sighed Mr. Prosser. And can we also assume, said Ford, that he's going to be staying here all day? So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing? Could be. Well, if you're resigned to doing that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you? What? You don't, said Ford patiently, actually need him here? Mr. Prosser thought about this. Well, no, not as such, he said. Not exactly need. Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, So if you would just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound? Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. That sounds perfectly reasonable, he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on, said Ford, we can always cover for you in return. Thank you very much, said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. Thank you very much. Yes, that's very kind. He frowned, then smiled, then tried to do both at once, failed, grasped hold of his fur hat and rolled it fitfully round the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. So, continued Ford Prefect, if you would just like to come over here and lie down. What? Said Mr. Prosser. I'm sorry, said Ford. Perhaps I hadn't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lie in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them driving into Mr. Dent's house, will there? What? Said Mr. Prosser again. It's very simple, said Ford. My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come here and take over from him. What are you talking about? Said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. You want me, said Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, to come and lie there? Yes. In front of the bulldozer? Yes. Instead of Mr. Dent? Yes. In the mud. In, as you say, the mud. As soon as Mr. Prosser realised that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a weight lifted itself off his shoulders. This was more like the world as he knew it. He sighed. In return for which you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub. That's it, said Ford. That's it, exactly. Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. Promise? He said. Promise, said Ford. He turned to Arthur. Come on, he said to him. Get up and let the man lie down. Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly, sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself round his bottom and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. And no sneaking knocking Mr. Dent's house down whilst he's away, all right? The mere thought, growled Mr. Prosser, hadn't even begun to speculate, he continued, settling himself back. about the merest possibility of crossing my mind. He saw the bulldozer driver's union representative approaching and let his head sink back and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noise, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable or put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids. Bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliations, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day. What a day. Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingoes' kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not now. Arthur remained very worried. But can we trust him? He said. Myself, I'd trust him to the end of the earth, said Ford. Oh yes, said Arthur. And how far's that? About 12 minutes away, said Ford. Come on, I need a drink. And that is the end of chapter 1. And the end of my video, which is, I'm glad for. Next time I'm going to remember to have a drink with me. My voice is shot. But thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I did much better than I did the first time I tried this. And I will see you next time whenever I feel like recording the next chapter. So until then, take care. Stay safe. Love and peace.